So I'm going to hit record. So welcome everybody. I'm Jeremy Solon with ThinkWater and UW Extension. Thanks for joining us today. This webinar today is part of our monthly Wisconsin Water Thinkers Network webinar series. We're offering these on the last Wednesday of each month. With the exception of December, we're going to take a break. So actually our next webinar will be January 25th, 2017. And I'll remind you that hopefully as we wrap up this presentation today. But I'm really excited that you're all here and that we have two great presenters that are going to focus on using social science today. Dr. Deidre Peroff is with UW Sea Grant, and Dr. Aaron Thompson is with UW Stevens Point and UW Extension, and they are going to share with us some ideas of using social science to inform water action. So I am going to turn it over to them. Both of them will present, and we'll hold questions until the end of the presentation. So 30-35 minutes in, we'll have an opportunity for dialogue, and again, you can either ask those questions at that time by turning on your microphone or type those into the chat box. So with that, I'm going to turn over presentation to Deidre, and she will get us started. I'm going to make my floating head go away.
All right. I don't see that it's over here yet. Is it? Can you see it?
Yeah, I may have given you the wrong one. Here, I'll make you.
Sorry.
I'll make this Deidre the presenter.
Okay.
There you go.
All right, great. All right, so, okay, can you see that?
Yep, that looks good.
All right, great. All right, so it's great to be here. I haven't done a webinar in a long time, so this is kind of interesting. So my name is Deidre Peroff, and I am the Social Science Outreach Specialist at Wisconsin Sea Grant, and I'm based at the School of Freshwater Sciences in Milwaukee. I'm also adjunct faculty there and an affiliate of the Center for Water Policy most recently, so I've been here about a year. Almost a year. So my background a little bit is in social science fields of geography, and I just finished up my Ph.D. in May in Parks and Recreation and Tourism Management. So I've always kind of had this interest of people and the environment broadly. So today, I also want to tell you a little bit about Sea Grant. I'm sure a lot of you are pretty familiar with Sea Grant, but basically we focus on research, education, and outreach related to water challenges and coastal issues. There's 29, I believe, different coastal programs, always affiliated with the university, and it's a state-federal partnership under NOAA. And we really try to focus on actionable science, too, if you've ever heard that term. So really working at using science to make informed decisions by connecting with partners, organizations, and working directly with stakeholders to have the greatest impact. So the 4 topic areas are kind of listed there, and the cool thing about social science is that it can kind of, I can kind of fit into any of these topic areas that you can see on your screen, hopefully. So I'm just going to give kind of a broad overview of what social science is, how it can be used in a water context, and also how it might be might be relevant to some of the work that you do. And then Aaron Thompson at UW Stevens Point is going to go into a little more detail about some case studies that he's been working on and some of the concepts that I introduced here. So Sea Grant, the interesting thing is I've been studying it for a really long time, and until recently I've never really thought about how to define it, so it can be kind of complex. But I think that everyone probably has some familiarity of social science in some aspect. Maybe it follows under the umbrella that lists of all these different disciplines or focus areas listed here. But Segrant defines social science research as the process of describing, explaining, and predicting human behavior as practiced by individuals and groups. So really, I try to think of it as focused on some aspect of human behavior. So in context, it would be understanding factors that influence behavior, how behavior is connected to social and environmental challenges, and then specifically in our context and how that's related to water challenges. So why is it important? I just kind of pulled this quote. There's probably hundreds of quotes I could have pulled, but this kind of shows the connection of people and the environment, which I think sometimes is overlooked a little bit. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. Basically how we can't really put the blame of environmental problems on certain sectors, but we have to understand the root causes of society that cause these problems and how all of us are contributing to environmental issues and challenges, and how we have to really kind of understand social structures as well to really get to the root causes of these environmental issues. And okay, so like I just said, understanding the root causes of society's problems, really finding effective solutions to quote-unquote wicked problems. That is a term that's also come up more recently when talking about these really complex issues. It involves understanding beliefs and norms and values and trends. So really understanding people's worldviews and kind of how that influences their decision making. It involves communication and messaging. So this is also a good implication that social science can be used for, is figuring out that we're appropriately communicating with stakeholders, appealing to audiences like in their own language or using their own messaging or something that they can relate to, working with partnerships and networks, but also just not developing more and more partnerships, but understanding how those networks work and how they can be more effective and more successful working together. Also assessing trust. So figuring out, if we're going to try to make positive change towards the environment and social issues and things like that, what kind of ways can we work with people that they would trust? So what kind of people do they trust? What kind of networks? Who are they going to listen to? Things like that. And then I think of it kind of as bridging the gap between some of the natural physical sciences, like a lot of what happens in this building at the School of Freshwater Sciences, and then kind of what happens on the ground with community members. So kind of working at it like that. And then if any of you saw Jeremy's first webinar, it was about systems thinking, and I think it's very much related to systems thinking. So it's thinking of things as being more interconnected, using this DSRP model, and then thinking about how social science can help influence political or economic or social environmental decision making. So, all right. So I just wanted to talk briefly about, give you some examples of what social sciences might do. So my predecessor, Jane Harrison, who had this position for a year and a half or so, her background was in economics. So she did a few studies that were economics related, more specifically. And then I had a colleague in North Carolina that did this, focused on this first question: how will climate change in the North Shore of Minnesota influence the tourism industry? So they were really looking at surveying people that come to that tourism area, and how maybe when there's less snow or when the climate's changing a little bit in the future, if that's really going to impact one of their main sources of income in that community. The second question is, what's the economic impact of the decline of yellow perch? That's one that I just sort of pulled up. I don't know if anyone's actually doing that study, but you would want to work with consumers and fishermen and the tourism industry And then what's an economic impact of beach closures? And that's one that Jane Harrison worked on with Sandra McClellan here. I personally am really interested in social equity and environmental justice issues. So one of the studies I'm working on right now is how do people in low-income neighborhoods receive information about severe weather or coastal storms. So if you look at Katrina and some of the other major severe weather storms like the tornado in Joplin, things like that, it seems that people in kind of lower economically disadvantaged communities are more at risk of, losing their lives and their livelihoods because of these severe storms, and so I'm kind of asking why. And I'm partnering with the National Weather Service for this project to see if it has something to do with the technology that people have, and if they're using that technology. And then also it comes back to that trust factor of who do they trust to get this information, and then how are they responding to it. And if people are in lower income neighborhoods, are they less likely to respond to the messaging that they're receiving about severe weather? So a lot of these factors kind of come in. Let's see. So then another one was quantifying and understanding the disconnect among underserved communities with coastal resources. That's another project that I'm working on a little bit with Milwaukee Water Commons as part of the Water City Agenda. And we're just applying for some grants right now for this, but a lot of people anecdotally have kind of said that lower income communities and disenfranchised communities in the Milwaukee area they don't have this connection to water, even though they're so close to the water. And so we're kind of figuring out what some of these barriers are that are contributing to that issue. First of all, quantifying and figuring out what the issue is, and then is it connected to social, cultural, economic barriers, or even transportation barriers, or is it just that a lot of these kids, aren't learning how to swim, and is that because, schools or pools are closing, or they don't have access? So there's a lot of things going on, but that is a big kind of overarching research question that we're asking here. And then one that I've kind of thought about is greening schools impacting well-being. So we've talked a lot about green infrastructure in this field, and how that's better for protecting stormwater, preventing chemicals and nitrogen and phosphorus and things like that from getting into the Lake Michigan untreated. But we want to look at more, what are the other benefits of greening schools and putting in green infrastructure. And then finally, some of the political questions related to social science that I've worked on are, what are the effects on the health and well-being of residents after cleaning up areas of concern? So I've worked a little bit with the Friends of Lincoln Park, and we're kind of maybe going to start doing some exercises around that. I'm not sure if it'll be a full social science study or not, but it's a question that we're considering. What are the policy alternatives to coastal bluff management? This is a project I recently worked on related to Great Lakes water level rises and how that's affecting property owners north of Milwaukee. And then how are climate change beliefs related to the timing of extreme weather events? And this is just a talk that I saw yesterday with Stuart Carlton at Texas Sea Grant, and I don't know, I thought it was a good question to throw in here, because he actually found that people aren't likely to change their climate change beliefs based on based off of extreme weather events. And before, people were kind of thinking that people would respond to more tragic events, but it looks like we have to go a little bit further in working on those belief systems. So just the last couple of slides real briefly. So if you are going to do a social science study, I think Aaron's going to talk a little bit too about how to go about doing this, and really kind of showing that it's something that does require a lot of expertise. It's something, and there is a difference between social science studies and doing evaluations and things like that. But so you want to kind of go back to the slide before and say, what are your research questions? You want to look at, really take a lot of time in setting up the design, looking at your audience or your participants, who you're trying to reach, who you're trying to survey or interview, or and then time and budget is actually a huge one, because you might have I always get really excited when I think about a new project, and then I end up setting up a new dissertation or something, and I definitely don't want to do that. So you have to think about the time that it'll take, the budget that you can have, where you want to get funding, and what is realistic considering the time and the budget, and then what's appropriate for the study. A lot of people think, and then you have to, look at qualitative versus quantitative versus if you want to do a combo of methods. I think initially a lot of people think social science and they think survey, but a lot of times it's better to really go out there and do focus groups or interviews or one-on-one meetings to really get an idea of what you're talking about. Because when you do a survey and that's the only kind of method that's used, everyone's answers is kind of bunched into a box. So it's better to kind of figure out what the different options are for responses that you can get through the research that you're conducting, if that makes sense. And then also, if you are going to do a survey, you have to kind of assess how you're going to analyze it first. And these are all things that we could go way more in depth with, but I don't have the time. So I would also just say the pilot study is really, really important. But the reason I threw this slide in there is just to show how much time and effort and thought it goes into really designing a good study. So yeah, and then this just shows kind of the breadth of the different methods that can be used, and so I definitely suggest consulting with social scientists to kind of see what different methods are out there and what can be used, and which would be most appropriate for the research question that's around, that you have. So and I think I'll probably stop there because I know Aaron has a lot to talk about as well. So that's about it. There's my email address, and I'm sure we'll have time for questions later.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Deidre. I'm going to shift this over to Aaron. Perfect.
All right, can you see it now?
Yep, looks good.
All right. Well, thank you, Deidre, for the introduction. And as we started talking about this and planning for this webinar a few weeks ago, right? I think Deidre and I got way overly excited, and we're like, we could do all of these different things, and we're still trying to fit a lot of things in here today. But certainly, those of you who are here participating in the call, I think Deidre and I both serve as resources for those kind of questions, and so feel free to follow up with us. Just as an introduction to myself, so I split my time as an associate professor here at UW-Stevens Point, and the other half of my time is as an extension specialist. And really, I work to support natural resource planning efforts all around the state. A lot of the work that I do is applied human dimensions work, so this brings in the social science component, and certainly that means I spend a lot of time with community capacity building. And in the last few years, a lot of this has been around water. And so what I really wanted to do today, when I really sat down and tried to zero in on like the one topic I wanted to share, is I wanted to share a recent project that I've completed working with a specific lake group, where the Think Water materials and kind of this introduction that the Wisconsin Water Thinkers Network has kind of added this systems thinking perspective into this discussion. Like, there's been one project where I've really started to kind of integrate that, and I wanted to share that with all of you. So I think Deidre did a great job introducing all of this, but this is the question I often start with: why is it time to bring social science or human dimension science into water issues here in Wisconsin? This is a 30-second Google search that I did on Wisconsin conflict and water quality about 2 years ago, and you can see that it's in the news, right? Conflict over water issues is there. To be honest, I went to update this a few weeks ago and decided not to, because some of these headlines have gotten much nastier in the meantime. And so there is a lot of conflict. It is very much something that communities are struggling with. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but again, I think Deidre introduced all of this, the applied social ecological research. This is where we're trying to bring together sociology, planning, social psychology to inform action at the landscape scale. And again, I'm not gonna dwell on this for too long, but at times this gets confused with what I call public participation surveys, or things where you're really trying to use them as an educational tool. And Deidre just introduced all this. It's really work that's being driven by research questions. It's always best when it's part of an ongoing planning process where we're directly informing community decision making. So, you know, as a social scientist and somebody who works with communities all the time, one of the things that does come up pretty frequently is that conversations start with, you know, we need to change the behavior of, right? I'm a social scientist, right? People attach to that behavior question. You know, so we want to change the behavior of farmers. You know, maybe we should try farmer-led councils, or we want to change the behavior of something much simpler, right? You know, people reusing using reusable water containers instead of using plastic bottles, right? Maybe we should try. Well, a lot of the work that we're talking about here is that how can we pull together the body of social science theory, pull together what's known in the literature so we're not guessing at these things. We need better information, and we need to be informed as we try and move into these water challenges. You know, as a planner, I often talk about this from the perspective of, you know, process-driven decision-making. And really what that means is that as we move through any one of these problems, the type of social science information that we need is going to change. And so today I'm really going to talk specifically about one application. And so that application is work that I've been doing with a lot of lake communities around the state of Wisconsin, so watershed or lake management planning efforts, where there's some very basic questions that the community has, right? And so some of these questions that jump up are things like, you know, what do stakeholders want? What will they support? What won't they support? You know, how do they currently view their water resource? Who do they look to for leadership? What are the ideas they will support? Well, many of these questions can turn into the type of research, the applied research that we can do as social scientists to support these efforts. And so the one I wanted to spend some time talking about here today is actually a study I just completed back in June for Bass Lake, which is the second largest lake, I believe, in St. Croix County. But it's a lake with a very small watershed. And so what's interesting about this, the surface watershed on this, is that, to be honest, all of the residents realistically live in a very, you know, very close proximity to one another. And in the end, we were able to survey the majority of those households, and, you know, we ended up getting a 60% response rate from this survey to look at, you know, kind of the challenges that they're facing. And before I jump away from this slide, none of this work is possible without the support of the active planning team that's on the ground. And so in this case, this is Cheryl Clemens with Harmony Environmental is leading this lake planning effort, but also St. Croix County, you know, and their staff that supported this work as well. And so we start with these basic questions of, you know, looking at broadly, you know, what will our lake stakeholders support? And this really comes back to this question of, you know, where can we identify consensus within the community? And so these common interests, those widely shared beliefs that exist in the community, right, these are the big challenges for us. And so one of the things that I do a lot with my work is that we begin with a process where we collect direct statements from the stakeholders themselves. And so statements that come back to us are things like I've got highlighted here on the slide, like, I believe water quality in Bass Lake is better than most other lakes in the area. Or Bass Lake provides good conditions for swimming near shore because the water clarity makes it easy to see what is underwater. Well, we take some of these statements and we filter them through a process, and then we send them back out to the survey, and we're able to use this to take the statements of their neighbors and see how broadly shared they are within their community. And so you'll see here's a list of the types of statements that come along with this. But what we're really looking for is how can this help inform a vision? How can this help inform, you know, a direction for this community as they try and deal with some of their water-related issues? And so rather than stay here on these statements, what this really means for this group is that where they agree is that residents that live around Bass Lake agree that they're willing to invest to protect their water quality. Right? This is a really important thing, right? The people, you know, the typical meeting where you get 5 or 10 people to show up out of the 110 households, they can all say these things, but we don't know how broadly shared those beliefs are within the community. The survey helped us understand where the community really sits at on these issues. Right? They also believe that lake management requires neighbors working together to resolve challenges. Right? So suddenly the social networks that exist within this community become the focus of attention for any planning implementation efforts that will come out down the road. We can also start to peek into their goals, and so things like they're motivated to act from the benefits that are connected to improving fish and wildlife habitat on their lake. And they also see recreation enhancement as really important. So those are the kind of things that, those are those points of access into the dialogue with these stakeholders that we can start to develop a plan for managing some of the water quality issues that they're seeing. And so, kind of jumping a little bit further into my process, right, one of the things we're really trying to understand is that what are the dominant belief systems that exist in this community? And so what we learned about this community is that 67% of those that responded to the survey believe that conditions are acceptable today, right? They believe that the water quality here is better than most other area lakes, and while there are some bad days, most of the time this lake meets their needs. But there's also this smaller group, this, about 1 in 4 people that live around the lake that believe that Bass Lake is getting dirtier. The algae blooms in the summer are decreasing their desire to spend time here. And in a lot of ways, the second group, the group that sees these challenges that exist, are matching with what we know about the biological and physical conditions of this water body. And so we're seeing some of this, challenges that present themselves in this. And what all of this means, and here on this next screen, you'll see that some of this varies depending on whether somebody's a primary residence, whether they own shoreline property, or maybe most interesting is that the part of the community that really is perceiving that the water quality is under threat are actually those second-tier landowners. Not the people that own the shoreline, but the people that live around the lake that are just off of the lake, right? They're users, but they don't actually own shoreline. They view these challenges. But ultimately, the message here is the community lacks a call to action, and so they're really struggling with this notion that if conditions are acceptable today, what motivates people to act? And I'm moving through a lot of this fairly quickly, but a lot of this is just part of what we're trying to do with these social science studies. And so this slide kind of encapsulates a lot of that process, that there are many different things that we're trying to collect as part of the planning process with the social science information that we're bringing into this. But for today, I really want to focus on this notion of call to action. And so that the idea that there are some of these, dominant views, like we were seeing here on the previous slide, that whether somebody views the conditions as acceptable today versus whether they see these problems emerging, that motivates whether or not they're willing to act. And that's an important part of this dialogue as well. And so where I've started to bring, Jeremy actually sent this out, to the whole Wisconsin Water Thinkers Network about 2 weeks before I gave a presentation to the Bass Lake community. And I was drawn to this graphic for the very, reason that we're seeing some of these same trends. What we're really talking about here is how do we create change, right? How do we create a behavior change within those who live around this lake? And this idea that there is this continuum from those that kind of exist at the naysayer end of this to those who are really the leaders at the other end of this, and this notion of a committed minority being the ones that have to kind of drive their community was a really interesting concept, and one that we can actually take a step further in this case, and we can actually put some numbers to it. What we really see is that if we look at the thought leaders as those that are starting to see the emerging problems, the ones that match the known conditions and the long-term trend for water quality, the decline in water quality in this lake, right? We see that 1 in 4 emerging in that condition. And we also see that there are people that sit somewhere else, right? They see the conditions as acceptable today. The one interesting thing to note here is that we actually didn't see naysayers in this particular survey. They do emerge in a lot of the work that I do. People just absolutely think that everything is wrong with this lake and there is no future for it. But in this particular case, we didn't, and so I've dropped a black X over the top of this. And so, again, the dialogue starts to shift, and we're talking about this committed minority of people. Well, as a social scientist, I want to know more about that. What is it that's really motivating them? Because this small committed group of thought leaders is going to have to take action to bring their community along with them. And they need to lead by example, and they need to select priorities that are in line with a common vision that doesn't just represent their interests, but the interests of a broader part of their community to bring people along with them. And they also must be prepared to leverage focusing events. And so the idea of a focusing event is that when we have a negative water quality occurrence, when there's a big algae bloom on a lake, what is the message from the lake community to those that they're trying to change behavior? Those are those moments where there might be a potential to change some of the behaviors, change some of the thinking of those around the lake. But ultimately, all of this is going to circle back around to this notion of behavior change, right? How do we bring about some kind of lasting commitment to improving water conditions? And again, this goes back into that theory of planned behavior, that this is not a simple this is not a simple thing to study, but we can start to piece some of this out. And here today, I just want to focus on the notion of some of the attitudes. And so in this case, one of the things that we've started to study about those who own shoreline property, live around these lakes, these primary stakeholders, is that their perception of shoreline conditions, you know, even extending out to how a property has been developed. So their attitudes towards native vegetation, their attitudes towards, you know, how that protecting native vegetation or planting it comes up against their aesthetic values and other things. And so we began this process simply with putting the community through an exercise to evaluate what kind of landscapes do they do, and we put imagery in front of them, and we had them go through a process where we could kind of break down what they did and didn't like. And to be honest, the full spectrum of things exists, and just the two examples here are fairly extreme from one another, but there are people that like these types of landscapes. Well, this all goes back to that notion of a call to action. And we would start to recognize that this is something we could build into the survey. And so based on those visual assessments that we did, we built into the survey a sequence of questions that asked them to respond about the type of landscaping that is most appropriate around their lakeshore. And based on this, we were actually able, here at the bottom of the screen, we were able to take those conditions that are acceptable versus the challenge that exists and merge this with this landscape preference. And we have this, you know, we have these groups that emerge out of this. And so they're here really on the top left of the next screen is you know, these four quadrants. And it means that group one, which actually turned out to be the dominant group, they don't perceive a problem, right? Conditions are acceptable today, but they want to maintain the natural shorelines. Well, that starts to speak to their goals and what they want for the future. Group two views conditions as acceptable today, but they want a tidy, nice, clean landscape all the way. They want it mowed all the way to the edge, right? That's what we're seeing from them. And then group three emerges this completely different group that really focuses both on maintaining the natural shorelines, but they also perceive a problem that exists. And so, again, how do we take this back to looking at that, creating change within the Think Water model? And so the idea becomes one of, we start to be able to know more about our thought leaders. In this case, our thought leaders are really this group three, and it's one of the quotes that was submitted as part of the survey, I think, sums them up really nicely. And you know, so this is actually a member of group three that I consider to be the thought leaders for this community, who said that we owe it to future generations to leave the lake better than we found it. More people living on the lake and using it increases the pressure on the resources. Everyone has to give a little and not think only of their own interests, right? So already we're seeing, we're seeing some confirmation that we do have this group. Again, it's 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 people around the lake that they're already there. And so how do we cultivate that group? How do we bring them along with their leadership skills so that they can engage their own community on these issues? And so just kind of where I wanted to wrap up here for today is that, you know, where do we begin on these things? Well, a lot of this is that, you know, we use social science to help establish priorities. You know, so a lot of this can be very, you know, selecting specific behaviors that we need to know more information about and trying to identify who are those that are most likely to adopt, or how do we reach an audience that isn't, but we need them to adopt to protect our water quality. So one of those things that jumps out of that is that one-size-fits-all solutions just don't work. We need social science information to understand what is motivating individuals within that community. The second thing here is about knowing your audience, and so assessing the overall likelihood of support from key stakeholder groups. And one of the things that we often fail to do when it comes to water issues is that we try to develop a message, you know, so that broadly reaches across multiple communities. But what we're learning from the social science around water issues is that the motivation, the specific attitudes and opinions that are held by these different clusters of stakeholders actually are very unique, which goes back to their call to action is going to be different. How they receive that information is going to be different. So we need to be more specific with our messaging. And then the last part of this is that behavior change. Again, this is what we're all, you know, we all talk about with social sciences. We're trying to inform behavior change as an action. You know, it's going to take sustained effort, though, over time. And so this really is, you know, we're unlikely to get this 100% right on any first attempt. But if we can build from our thought leaders, if we can provide them with the support, we can help build their capacity within their own communities. That's what it's going to take to ultimately create behavior change in the landscape. And so I think I'm right on time to go ahead and open this up to questions. But there are many, many people that have helped contribute to a lot of this work, especially the lake work that I do here in Wisconsin. Many, many people have helped bring me into this. I think a couple of which are here on the call here this afternoon. So with that, Jeremy, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you to facilitate the questions.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Deidre. Nice job. So we can open it up to questions at this point. Again, you can either unmute yourself if you're muted and ask those questions directly, or feel free to type them into the chat box. And I have one question to get us started, and maybe both of you can respond to this. But if folks are interested in getting started, potentially connecting with someone to begin thinking about how do they integrate social science into the work they're doing, what are some of the resources that are available in Wisconsin to do that? Aaron and Deidre.
I've been here longer than Deidre, so maybe I'll start and then let her fill in. I mean, there are a few of us that do this work across the state. UW Extension probably has the most social scientists that are kind of connected, that are doing this type of work. So I mean, but there are a handful of other resources out there. To be honest, I think one of the best resources that we have is through the natural resource educators. I know Dan Zier, I think I saw this on the line. Dan's worked with, as a connecting point to social scientists that do this work in the past. And so that's certainly one place to go. Here at Stevens Point, we obviously, I do a lot of this work with communities, and, I work statewide in my role. We have some expertise at the regional campuses, and so it just depends on what part of the state you're in. UW Stout has really invested heavily, and they're doing some great things over in the Red Cedar Basin. I'm trying to think who else I'm missing. Deidre, do you have anybody else you'd add?
Yeah. Well, I just know kind of Sea Grant network. So there's a one that's through the NOAA office, in the Capitol. It's a Social Science Community of Practice network, and we have. It's mostly for Sea Grant people, but I think sometimes we do webinars and things like that to kind of talk more about social science and talk about different case studies and things like that. We just started a new one that's going to be quarterly yesterday. So I guess you could contact me if you're interested in that. I think that's kind of open to the public. Also, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I'm personally looking for more social scientists to kind of bounce stuff off of too. So I know a few of the different social scientists in the Sea Grant network, but I think it's just a matter of finding different people in the university and different universities that can help as well. But there are some resources just that kind of like at Sea Grant we have one page that kind of shows you some of the techniques you might want to use if you're going to do a survey. I can look for that link and post it in the chat box if I find it in time. Something like that. So there's definitely a lot of resources out there. It's just kind of a matter of finding them, and I'm still kind of working on that too. So.
Good. Thank you. Aaron, what's the best way to get a hold of you? Email the easiest?
Email's the easiest.
All right. I'm just going to plug this into the chat box just in case people don't have it. And if folks want to follow up with anything or looking for additional resources, you can get in touch with Aaron. Other questions? There was an earlier comment that I thought, Aaron, you might be interested in commenting on. Linda Keene had mentioned that the research techniques are similar to design research process. Linda has an architecture background, So she was just saying how interesting it is that there's similarities between the research techniques and the design research process. I thought those are some interesting kind of connections. I don't know if you wanted to add anything or say anything about that.
Well, I mean, I think I breezed right over the top of it, but I actually come, professionally, my background's in landscape architecture, and so a lot of this we come at it from the perspective of we're either dealing with an active change where there's something going on in the community where they're having to respond, or we're trying to think about long-term planning into the future. And so I think you see a lot of overlapping techniques that in terms of research, I think we're coming at it from a similar philosophy as kind of the design professions are, or the design disciplines are.
Yeah. Cool. And Deidre just popped in some of the Sea Grant resources related to social science. And Linda has another question related to data management and survey management. And how can the public access these? Linda, maybe you want to say a little bit more about that? As far as are these what they're related to? Is it more about the kind of tools and resources, so new knowledges? Deidre or Aaron, any responses to that? If you can see Linda's comments about data management, survey management, and the new knowledge that's being developed from that, and how the public is able to access some of those resources and ideas. I guess there's a lot going on in how we share data and survey tools that are available.
Well, I know that I don't know specifically sites or anything I can share at the moment, but I know that there are some efforts among different organizations to kind of find different ways to make a lot of the data public, particularly with GIS. I think they've come a long way. I don't know if you all are familiar with GIS, but it used to be really just through this ArcView, and now there's online GIS technology that pretty much anyone can access, and they have just tons of data in there as far as different, and they even have different what is it called, stories and things like that. I forget what the terminology is, but so there's lots of data that you can get through there. I know Reflow, which is a nonprofit here in Milwaukee, is working on kind of getting different data sources together to share with the public. But again, it's related to GIS and mapping. I'm not sure. I can't think of other ones at the moment, but
yeah.
Well, I might chime in. Maybe that's one of the things that again, there is. I mean, even with somewhat the limited capacity we have for social science research here in Wisconsin, there is quite a bit of really good work being done right now on this, and amongst those of us that are doing it, we're trying to figure out mechanisms for sharing, especially when it comes to water resources. This is kind of a new venture for a lot of people. Maybe that's a role that the Wisconsin Water Thinkers Network could play, is providing an opportunity to share some of these resources and get some of this information out. I mean, a lot can be learned from looking at other similar lakes that have gone through the study and looking at some of the information they've pulled back, even if it's only looking at it and then trying just with a group of others that are informed about your community, taking a look at it and saying, well, what might be different about our community, right? And using it as using some of these other studies as a leverage into a conversation within your own community about how do we create change? And so one of the things that I really like kind of about this Bass Lake example and how it lined up with the notion of thought leaders is that we often don't kind of intentionally have a discussion about who the thought leaders are within the community, kind of are those individuals actually sharing a vision for the future that reflects kind of something that others in the community can broadly attach themselves to. And so I don't know, maybe through the video, we could start to share some of those resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking back to our gathering last March or April, whenever that was, and one of the kind of related ideas that was a pretty strong theme was citizen science information and tools, and a place to have that. But I think there's a need for sharing resources, pretty broadly related to engaging the community in water-related efforts, and I think that's another piece of it that we can use WIGU for, help to build the understanding of social science and the resources and tools that are available to folks. So yeah, I think that'd be a great idea, and obviously is a need. So we have a question here from Julie about any advice for dealing with large watersheds?
Well, some of it depends on how big the watershed is. But, I just wrapped up a study to help inform the Eau Claire River TMDL process, where we were trying to collect information on a really tight budget to be representative of key critical areas within that watershed. So we actually went down to the Huck 12 and selected 4 sub-watersheds that were kind of, again, it was a process of working through with other partners there. But to identify, these 4 sub-watersheds so that we could at least get a snapshot, kind of a starting point for how things might be different across kind of a big geographic area. I mean, in that case, I think I want to say it touches 7 counties, but maybe slightly over on that.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that a lot of people face, which I kind of brought up with budgeting and time and things like that, is a lot of times it's if you have an idea for a study in mind, you have to make sure that you're reaching the audience in the technology or the way that that is appropriate for them. So for large watersheds and for large studies in general, obviously the cheapest, easiest option is to do some sort of online survey. But if you're working with farmers and other people that maybe aren't as in tune with emails every day and things like that, not that farmers aren't, but then you have to kind of figure out the best approach to that if you're really going to get the response rate that you need and things like that, if that's what the question means about how to do a large-scale survey or something.
Yeah, it seems like, it introduces complexity into it of how do you represent, I guess people across a broader geographic area, but you can begin to get at some of that at least through sampling, like Aaron's saying, or trying to find representative populations in different ways. But
well, and then I guess the other follow-up on that one is that, if you're dealing with a large watershed, this is exactly the kind of challenge that DNR is trying to figure out right now, is that how do we actually respond to some of these larger watersheds here in Wisconsin so we can get that kind of get the type of social science information that's needed to inform, to be honest, even inform kind of next steps as they think about how to prioritize resources moving forward.
Right. Yeah, and think about engagement strategies across those groups. So cool. Well, I think we'll wrap up there. So thank you very much, Deidre and Aaron. This was really interesting and helpful to a lot of us. As we wrap up, a couple of reminders. As I mentioned, we won't have a webinar in December, but our next webinar will be January 25th. And that one is going to focus on using a systems thinking tool called MAC, which stands for Map, Activate, and Check in water community engagement program design. So if you're interested in how to design effective programs, communications, that might be a webinar that's of interest. And then a plug to save the date for March 22nd. The Wisconsin Water Thinkers Network will be doing a gathering in Green Lake on that day, and it'll be an opportunity to explore some more of these topics. More information about that will be coming out in the early part of the year. But that's going to be a great gathering of like-minded folks, again, trying to figure out how we effectively engage the public in these complicated and complex water issues. So thank you all for being here. Again, thanks to Deidre and Aaron for sharing your expertise and resources. We'll get this posted soon, along with other related resources. So have a good rest of the month. Happy holidays. I'll talk to y'all soon. Take care.